Benton Harbor, Michigan, 1985. A small lakeside city that once thrived on factory work, now worn down by layoffs and empty buildings. Old industrial warehouses sat rusting at the edges of town, their windows broken, their parking lots overgrown with weeds. The air carried the faint smell of metal and cold lake water. People here worked hard, kept their heads down, and hoped the economy would turn around. On Maple Street, inside a modest two-bedroom home, lived the Carter family. Evelyn Carter worked long shifts at the local laundry facility, doing everything she could to raise her 6-year-old twin sons, Jacob and Jamal. The boys were well known in the neighborhood. Tiny, identical shadows who moved together everywhere they went. Their backpacks bounced the same way. Their footsteps matched. Their laughter echoed in the same rhythm. Jacob was the quieter one, soft-spoken and observant. He took time to study things before acting. Jamal was the opposite, curious, energetic, and always the first to ask questions, or run ahead before being called back. They balanced each other perfectly, the kind of bond only twins seemed to understand. The city wasn't unfamiliar with trouble. Crime existed, jobs were disappearing, and tension sometimes hung heavy in the air. But for the most part, people still cared about one another. Neighbors waved from their porches. Kids played outside until the street lights flickered on. Parents watched over the little ones walking to school. No one in Benton Harbor expected anything unusual to happen on the morning of November 14th. Nothing hinted at danger. It was just another cold Michigan day, the kind where frost coated the grass, and the breath of anyone stepping outside turned white in the air. Inside the Carter home, the twins were getting ready for a school day they were excited about. They had show and tell coming up. They had already chosen what they wanted to bring. They were talking about it non-stop, the way only 6-year-olds do. It was a morning like any other. But by the end of that day, Jacob and Jamal Carter would be gone, and their disappearance would become one of the most haunting cold cases Michigan had ever seen. The morning started earlier than usual in the Carter household. The cold seeped through the windows, and the sky outside looked pale and heavy, hinting at a long winter ahead. Inside, the twins were already awake, sitting cross-legged on their beds with their backpacks open in front of them. Jacob carefully inspected the small wooden airplane he had chosen for show and tell. The edges were smooth from years of handling, and he was proud to bring something their grandfather had made. Jamal kept rolling his red race car back and forth across the blanket, making quiet engine noises, imagining how he would show it off to the class. In the kitchen, Evelyn moved quickly between the counter and the table, packing lunch boxes while buttoning her work shirt. She was tired, running on too little sleep from another late shift, but she made sure the boys ate breakfast first. She watched them talk and laugh, and for a moment she let herself enjoy the normalcy of the morning. By 7:35 a.m., the house was full of movement, backpacks zipped, jackets pulled from hooks, shoes tied. The boys hurried from room to room, reminding each other not to forget their items. Evelyn checked the time again, brushing her hands on her apron. She knelt down in front of them and zipped their coats all the way to their chins, the way she always did when he was cold out. "Straight to school," she said. "No stopping, no shortcuts. Stay together." They nodded, repeating her rules back to her with the practiced tone of kids who heard them every day. Jacob tucked his airplane safely inside his bag. Jamal slipped his race car into his jacket pocket and patted it twice, satisfied. At 7:48 a.m., the front door opened. A rush of cold air swept into the hallway. The twins stepped outside, their breath steaming in the air as they made their way down the porch steps. Evelyn stood in the doorway for a moment longer, watching them walk toward the sidewalk before closing the door and grabbing her own coat for work. The boys moved down Maple Street side by side, as they always did. A neighbor walking his dog waved to them. Another person warming up their car saw them pass the corner. The twins walked with the easy confidence of children who knew their path well. Maple Street to Elm, Elm to Lincoln Elementary, less than a mile, a simple route. Around 7:55 a.m., someone driving to work saw them waiting at the corner store's intersection, backpacks bouncing slightly as they talked. A woman leaving her house noticed them crossing the street together, Jacob holding onto the shoulder strap of his backpack, while Jamal kicked a small patch of ice on the sidewalk. By 8:05 a.m., the boys should have been approaching the schoolyard. Kids were already gathering near the entrance, running around and blowing warm air into their hands. Teachers were preparing classrooms. Everything was moving normally. Then the timeline went blank. There were no more confirmed sightings. No one saw them turn onto the final street. No one saw them enter the school grounds. No one noticed anything unusual. No sudden commotion. No loud noises. No signs that something was wrong. At 8:30 a.m., they still hadn't arrived in class. Their teacher assumed they were running late. By 9:10, concern began to grow. The boys were never late. By 9:32, the school called Evelyn at work to ask why the twins were absent. Her heart dropped. She told them they had left home on time. They should have been there hours ago. Somewhere between Maple Street and Lincoln Elementary, during a walk that took less than 10 minutes, Jacob and Jamal vanished. When Evelyn arrived at the school, her steps were hurried and uneven. Teachers met her at the entrance, their faces lined with worry. They explained that the boys never came inside. Their cubbies were empty, their coats were missing, their seats were undisturbed. Evelyn repeated the same sentence over and over. They left the house on time. They walked the same route every day. They knew exactly where to go. Something was wrong. Police officers were notified shortly after. At first, the response was calm, almost routine. Two 6-year-olds walking to school on a cold morning could have wandered off, gotten distracted, or taken a wrong turn. But Evelyn insisted that wasn't possible. The twins didn't explore without her. They didn't leave the path. They didn't talk to strangers. Officers began a simple canvass of the neighborhood, asking residents if they had seen two small boys walking together. A neighbor confirmed seeing them around 7:55 a.m. Another said she watched them cross the street. A third person mentioned hearing what sounded like a whimper or a child's cry near the alley behind her garage around 8:10 a.m., but she wasn't sure if it was the Carter twins or kids from another block. Police checked the alley. Nothing, just cold pavement and trash bins. By noon, the search intensified. More officers arrived. Volunteers gathered. Parents left work early to help look for the boys. People began checking everywhere, behind houses, under porches, inside abandoned sheds, near the small wooded area north of Elm Street. Children's voices calling, "Jacob! Jamal!" echoed down the blocks. A man driving to work that morning contacted police after hearing the news. He remembered seeing a brown Chevy van parked strangely near the sidewalk on Maple Street, close to the time the boys would have been passing through. The engine was running, and exhaust filled the cold air. He didn't see the driver clearly, and at the time, he thought nothing of it. But in hindsight, he felt uneasy. Officers seized on that detail quickly. They started asking who in the area owned a brown van. Several people did, but none claimed to be near Maple Street that morning. The lead was promising but fragile. No one had seen the boys near the van. No one had seen them get inside. It was just a possibility. Search dogs were brought in during the early afternoon. They picked up the boys' scent along their usual route. The dogs followed it down Maple Street, past the corner store, toward Elm Street. Then halfway down the block, the dogs stopped. They circled, they pulled, they tried to continue, but the trail simply ended. No scent forward, none left or right. It was as if the boys had vanished in the middle of the sidewalk. Volunteers kept searching, fanning out farther from the neighborhood. The woods behind the old baseball field were combed through twice. The creek was checked. The drainage tunnels were inspected with flashlights. People walked door to door, knocking, calling out, pleading for any clue. But nothing surfaced. By late afternoon, the sense of worry turned into something heavier. People paused before speaking. Voices lowered. Some volunteers kept glancing toward the road, imagining a vehicle pulling up beside the twins without anyone noticing. It was a possibility no one wanted to say out loud. As daylight faded, the police chief announced they were treating the case as a possible abduction. The word hit the community hard. It changed everything. It made the cold air feel sharper and the shadows deeper. The initial search ended with no answers, only the chilling realization that two small boys had disappeared in broad daylight on a short route everyone believed was safe. As word spread that the twins were officially considered missing, Benton Harbor changed overnight. The quiet little streets that usually carried early winter stillness were suddenly filled with people knocking on doors, making phone calls, and searching through every corner of the neighborhood. Mothers held their children a little tighter. Kids walked home in pairs. People looked at passing cars with suspicion. Flyers with the boys' faces were printed in a rush and taped to every lamp post, store window, and church door. Volunteers handed them out at gas stations, supermarkets, and bus stops. Anyone driving through town that day saw the same two small faces staring back. Jacob, with his shy half-smile, and Jamal, with his bright, excited grin. The Carter home became a gathering point. Neighbors dropped off food, not because anyone was hungry, but because it felt like the only thing they could do. Evelyn sat on the couch, surrounded by people trying to comfort her, though most of the time she just stared out the window, waiting for her boys to run back home. She kept asking if the police were sure they checked every street, every yard, every building. She couldn't understand how two children could simply disappear. Rumors began spreading in all directions. Some thought the twins must have wandered into the woods. Others believed a stranger passing through the area stopped and grabbed them. A few whispered about the broken economy and rising crime, convinced the city was no longer safe for children walking alone. Throughout the afternoon and evening, police followed dozens of leads, many of them false. Someone reported seeing two children matching the boy's description near the old baseball field, but it turned out to be siblings from another neighborhood. Another person claimed to see a pair of small footprints near the creek, but they belonged to kids who had been playing there earlier in the week. Someone else swore the twins had boarded a school bus they weren't assigned to, but the bus driver checked and confirmed it wasn't them. Every promising lead ended the same way: a dead end. The tension in the community grew heavier. Parents left work early. Some refused to let their children walk anywhere. Groups organized nighttime searches, walking with flashlights through empty lots and behind shuttered buildings, calling the boys' names into the cold air, even when hope felt distant. Local news. Reporters arrived before sunset, filming the frantic search efforts. Interviews with neighbors played on the evening broadcast. Photographs of the boys appeared on the screen. The anchors spoke about the case with the somber tone reserved for tragedies that unfold too close to home. As night fell, the town felt divided between exhaustion and fear. Residents who had known the boys since birth struggled to accept that no one saw what happened. The idea that two children could vanish on a 10-minute walk in broad daylight didn't seem real. But the longer the silence lasted, the more frightening it became. By the end of the day, Benton Harbor was no longer just searching. The town was grieving something it didn't yet have the words for. And for the first time, people began whispering the possibility everyone had been avoiding. Someone had taken the Carter twins. The day after the twins disappeared, police focused their attention on the only solid lead they had. The brown Chevy van reported on Maple Street that morning. Officers canvassed the area again, asking who owned similar vehicles. One name kept coming up: Edward Mallory. Mallory was a 42-year-old factory worker who lived 3 blocks from the Carter home. He kept mostly to himself, didn't have many friends, and was known for his unpredictable temper. He wasn't the type of person invited to barbecues or block parties. When his name surfaced, several neighbors quietly admitted they had always found him off. Police brought Mallory in for questioning. He arrived looking irritated rather than scared, insisting he didn't have time for this nonsense. He claimed he had been at home all morning, drinking coffee before his shift. When asked about his van, he said he hadn't taken it out that day. But his story shifted under pressure. After being confronted with a witness statement, he changed his answer, saying he might have driven around the block to warm up the engine. Investigators noticed his uneasiness. His answers were vague, inconsistent, and delivered with a defensive tone. He sweated heavily, wiped his palms against his jeans, and avoided eye contact. When they asked if he had seen the Carter twins, he shook his head too quickly. Officers got permission to search his van. The inside was unnervingly clean, too clean. The floor mats looked recently scrubbed, and the seats were free of dust or debris. No toys, no wrappers, no tools, nothing personal. Just a hollow, empty space that set off alarm bells. But there was a problem. There was no concrete evidence. No fibers, no fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses who claimed to see the boys near the vehicle. And without proof, suspicion wasn't enough. Investigators searched Mallory's house. His living room was cluttered, his kitchen a mess, and his bedroom stacked with old newspapers. Nothing linked him to the twins. No clothing, no belongings, no signs they had ever been inside. Mallory grew more frustrated with each. Pass an hour. He yelled that the police were wasting their time. He accused the neighbors of lying. He insisted he didn't know the Carter family and had never spoken to the boys. Still, detectives could feel it. Something about him wasn't right. But as much as they wanted him to be the key to the case, they couldn't force the evidence to appear. They couldn't hold him without cause. Late that night, they let him go, Word spread quickly through the community. Some residents became convinced Mallory was involved. They whispered about the van. They pointed at his house. A few even followed him when he walked outside, as if observing him might reveal the truth. But the police had no choice but to move on. They couldn't build a case around a hunch. Mallory returned to his daily routine, though people watched him carefully. He avoided eye contact with neighbors, kept his blinds closed, and drove his van less often, aware that the entire town now viewed him as a possible kidnapper. Despite the suspicion surrounding him, the investigation soon hit another wall. The more officers dug, the less they found. Every lead involving Mallory drifted into uncertainty. And while the community remained fixated on the brown van, investigators knew they couldn't afford to focus on only one suspect. If they were wrong, precious time was slipping away. The case was already beginning to cool, and the twins were still missing. Evelyn barely slept during the first days after her sons vanished. She moved through the house like a shadow, drifting from room to room, stopping at every small reminder of them. Their shoes are near the door, their drawings on the fridge. Their cereal bowls are still drying on the counter from the morning they disappeared. Nothing felt real. She refused to let the twins' bedroom change. The blankets stayed unwashed, toys stayed where they left them, and the nightlight remained plugged in, casting a soft glow across the room each night, as if the boys were still there. Every morning, before work or before meeting with detectives, she walked the route the twins always took to school. She retraced every step they should have made. Maple Street to Elm, Elm to the schoolyard, searching for anything the police might have missed. Sometimes she spoke their names softly under her breath, hoping they might answer, hoping she might hear them, hoping for something, anything. The community supported her, but support wasn't enough. Evelyn pushed harder than anyone. She printed flyers at her own expense and handed them out until her hands were sore. She taped posters on store windows, bus stops, laundromats, and church doors. She begged local businesses to let her leave stacks of flyers by their registers. Most agreed. Some cried with her. She called the police station constantly, sometimes multiple times a day, asking for updates. Many times, there were none. Investigators were working, but the case was stalling. The leads thinning out one by one. Each time the phone rang, she leapt toward it, praying it would be the call she needed. It never was. Journalists reached out, and Evelyn didn't hesitate. She stood in front of cameras with trembling hands, holding up pictures of her boys as she pleaded with the public. She spoke through tears, telling the world who her sons were, what they loved, what they feared, what they meant to her. She begged for help. She begged for answers. She begged for whoever had them to bring them home. Some nights, she sat at the kitchen table staring at the boys' schoolwork, running her fingers over the handwriting on worksheets and coloring pages. She imagined them walking through the door again, backpacks sliding off their shoulders, excited to talk about their day. Then the silence would crush her all over again. People told her to rest, but she couldn't stop. She attended every search effort, every meeting, every gathering. She showed up even when the police didn't need her there. She talked to neighbors, begged strangers for any detail they might have forgotten. She refused to let anyone forget her sons or move on. What kept her going was the belief, an anchor she clung to, that her boys were still alive. She refused to entertain any other possibility. She said it every day. She said it so often that even those who feared the worst tried to believe it for her. But as the weeks dragged on, the lack of progress began to wear her down. Her voice grew weaker. Her eyes grew tired. She kept fighting, but the weight of uncertainty pressed harder with each passing day. The world around her continued its routines. People went to work. Kids played outside. The seasons slowly shifted. But for Evelyn, time had stopped the moment the boys failed to show up at school. She didn't know it yet, but her fight was only just beginning. The search was about to stretch far beyond what anyone expected. The case wasn't going cold. It was freezing. And Evelyn Carter refused to let the world forget her sons, no matter how long it took. As the months passed, the search for the Carter twins slowed. The flyers faded in the weather, their edges curling, and their colors bleaching under the sun. Fewer volunteers showed up to the weekly search efforts. The news coverage shifted to other stories. People still cared, but life pushed them forward, even as Evelyn remained stuck in the same day. By early 1986, the case was officially cold. The original investigators had exhausted every lead. Every witness had been interviewed. Every home within a 2-mile radius searched, or so the reports said. Evelyn never believed the search was thorough enough. She kept pushing, calling the station, demanding updates. Most of the time, the answer was the same: no new information. In 1987, a new detective transferred into the department, Marcus Hale. He was younger than the others who had worked the case, less hardened, carrying the kind of determination that made him linger late in the office long after the others were gone. The Carter file caught his attention immediately, a thick binder overflowing with conflicting statements, dead leads, and frustratingly sparse evidence. He stayed up late reading through it, mapping out the timeline on a chalkboard. Something about the gaps bothered him. Witness statements didn't align. 2 reports seemed to have been filed out of order. A handwritten note about the janitor hearing crying near the tool shed had never been followed up. A maintenance worker's tip about a second van, a blue one, had been buried in an unrelated document. Hale felt the weight of these details. He knew cases didn't go cold because of fate. They went cold because something had been overlooked, ignored, or lost. In 1988, Hale reopened parts of the investigation. He re-interviewed neighbors, hoping time had loosened memories. Some remembered things differently. Some didn't remember anything at all. A few refused to talk, fearful of digging up old suspicions. He requested access to the evidence storage room, hoping to re-examine whatever physical items still existed. But most of the evidence was minimal. Photocopies of flyers, maps, a few objects found unrelated, a strap fragment believed to be from a child's bag, but never confirmed. Forensics at that time couldn't do anything meaningful with it. Still, Hale pushed on. Meanwhile, Evelyn continued her own search. She attended every community meeting related to missing children. She called organizations in other states. She traveled to surrounding towns whenever someone reported seeing children resembling the twins. Each trip ended the same way: disappointment and another hole in her hope. By 1989, the community had developed its own theories. Some believed the twins were taken by someone passing through town, someone who disappeared just as quickly. Others blamed the declining safety of the city, convinced that crime had swallowed the boys. A few insisted the original suspect, Edward Mallory, had gotten away with it. Mallory, bitter and tired of being watched, eventually moved to a different part of Michigan. No one saw him leave, but everyone noticed his house standing empty. Through all of this, Detective Hale kept digging. He wasn't making progress, but he refused to let the case fall into the pile of forgotten files collecting dust. Whenever he was off duty, he found himself thinking about the twins. He studied pictures of them until he memorized every detail of their faces. In 1990, he submitted a request for new resources, hoping for specialized investigative support. The request was denied due to budget cuts. The city was struggling. The department didn't have the funds. Hale realized that for now, he had hit the same wall as everyone before him. Without new evidence or a confession, the case would remain frozen in time. Still, he refused to close the file. He left it on his desk, where he would see it every morning when he came into work. It was his quiet promise to the boys. The investigation wasn't over. It was simply waiting for something to break. In early 1993, a small spark of hope appeared when a man in the county jail claimed he had information about the Carter twins. His name was Raymond Cutter, a career criminal known for petty theft, drugs, and a long history of lying to get better treatment. Still, when detectives heard he wanted to talk specifically about the Carter case, they couldn't ignore it. Detective Hale met with him in a cramped interview room. Cutter leaned back in his chair, acting as if he were doing the department a favor. He claimed he had shared a cell with Edward Mallory years earlier, and that Mallory had confessed to taking the twins. According to Cutter, Mallory said he grabbed the boys because they were alone and no one was watching. He said Mallory described the fear in their voices and the way he forced them into his van. Cutter repeated every detail with theatrical confidence, as if he were reciting lines from a script. But the more he talked, the more holes appeared in his story. He got the date wrong. He described a location Mallory had never been associated with. He said the boys were wearing clothes they hadn't owned at the time. He even switched their names halfway through the conversation. Hale listened carefully, letting Cutter talk himself into contradiction after contradiction. He had dealt with informants like this before. They wanted leniency, early release, special privileges, whatever they could get. Cutter eventually admitted he hoped his cooperation would reduce his sentence. The statement was written down anyway and added to the already messy case file. But Hale knew it held no value. It was another distraction, another detour, another false lead in a case filled with them. The informant wasn't the only one trying to insert himself into the investigation. Over the next year, police received several tips from people claiming to have heard something, seen something, or known someone who bragged about involvement. None of these tips held up. Some people wanted attention. Others wanted reward money. A few were simply trying to stir drama. Every false lead drained more energy from the investigation. Each time someone provided a story, Evelyn let herself hope, only to have that hope yanked away again and again. She grew more cautious about believing anything the police told her, but she still listened because she had no other choice. Detective Hale continued digging through the file, trying to make sense of the contradictions. He revisited old statements, remapped the twins' route, and searched for anything the original investigation had missed. But each time he thought he had found a thread to pull, it unraveled into nothing. By 1994, the case felt trapped in a cycle of false confessions and dead ends. Cutter eventually admitted to another inmate that he had made everything up, bragging that he almost became famous for solving a case he knew nothing about. The confession officially collapsed, and the department moved on once again. The years continued slipping by, and the truth about Jacob and Jamal remained hidden somewhere out of reach. The case stayed open, but no one knew what direction to take anymore. The only thing everyone agreed on was that the answers weren't coming from jailhouse stories. They would have to come from somewhere else entirely. By 2001, 16 years had passed since the twins vanished. The case had become a quiet wound in Benton Harbor, something people mentioned only when the anniversary came around or when old fears resurfaced. New families moved into the area without knowing the story. Children grew up hearing only fragments of what happened. The Carter twins slowly drifted into a fog of fading memory. But everything changed when a regional true crime TV program decided to feature the case. They interviewed Evelyn, now older and visibly more worn, her eyes still carrying the weight of a mother searching for answers. Detective Hale also appeared, speaking about the gaps in the investigation and the leads that went nowhere. The episode aired one evening in October, and within days, the station received new calls from people who claimed they remembered something. Two of those calls stood out. The first came from a woman who had been a teenager at the time. She said she never realized the importance of what she'd seen until she watched the documentary. She remembered walking to her bus stop the morning the twins disappeared. Near the corner of Elm Street, she saw two small boys who looked scared and confused, and a man standing a few feet behind them. She couldn't remember his face clearly, but she remembered one detail with certainty. The boys looked like they were being pulled towards someone rather than walking willingly. When she had told her mother about it back then, her mother dismissed it as neighborhood kids fooling around. No one ever contacted the police. And by the time the news of the disappearance spread that afternoon, the memory had already grown blurry. The second call came from a former bus driver who lived in another county. He said he saw a blue van, not brown, speeding away from the Maple Street area early that morning. It was an older work van with faded paint and no back windows. He remembered the sound it made, loud, rattling, like the muffler was failing. He didn't see children inside, but the timing struck him as odd, and the driver seemed to be in a hurry. Back in 1985, he had mentioned the van to someone in passing, but it never made it into any official report. Either no one followed up, or the information was lost among the chaos of the early investigation. Detective Hale felt a jolt of adrenaline when he heard these statements. They didn't match the brown van theory that consumed the case for years. They introduced the possibility of a second vehicle on the scene. Second suspect. A second opportunity for something to have gone terribly wrong. The blue van changed everything. It meant the community had been watching the wrong man. It meant the investigation had been narrowed too tightly. It meant something vital had slipped through the cracks the first time around. Hale took both statements seriously. He drove to meet each witness in person, recording new interviews, taking meticulous notes, and plotting their memories on a fresh map of the area. For the first time in years, he felt like he was chasing a real lead. But the memories were old. Details had faded. Faces were unclear. Timelines blurred. Still, something felt different now. Something finally made sense in a way the original investigation never had. The brown van may have been a coincidence, but the blue van the one no one had properly investigated, might have been the real clue waiting patiently in the shadows for 16 years. It wasn't enough to solve the case yet, but it was enough to reopen hope. By 2020, the Carter case had officially been cold for 35 years. Benton Harbor had changed drastically since the twins' disappearance. New houses replaced old ones, businesses came and went, and most of the original investigators had long since retired. But Detective Hale, older now with gray streaks in his hair, still thought about the case every single week. He kept the file on a separate shelf in his home office, refusing to let it gather dust among the forgotten. That year, the state established a new cold case unit specializing in forensic re-examination. Technology had advanced in ways that no one in 1985 could have imagined. DNA techniques were sharper, more sensitive, capable of extracting profiles from materials once considered useless. Hale didn't hesitate. He submitted a request to have the Carter evidence reviewed. It wasn't much: several photos, vague notes, a few small items collected near the boy's route, but one piece stood out: a strap fragment believed to have come from a child's backpack. At the time, investigators weren't even sure if it belonged to either of the twins. It had been found near the intersection where the scent trail from the search dogs ended. The evidence had been stored for decades in a sealed envelope, untouched and forgotten. The cold case unit took it in for testing. Weeks passed with no update. Hale checked his phone constantly. He thought about Evelyn, who was still alive but aging quickly. He wondered what she would think if something finally broke after all these years. Then late one afternoon, he received the call he had been waiting for. The lab found DNA on the strap. Not a full profile, just a partial one, but strong enough to run through the state database. Hale sat quietly as the analyst explained that the sample did not match either of the twins nor anyone in their family. It belonged to an adult male. Even more important, it didn't match Edward Mallory. For the first time in decades, the investigation had a scientific lead pointing away from the original primary suspect. The brown van theory, the one that had dominated the case for years, began to crumble. Hale felt a mix of adrenaline and frustration. On one hand, this meant they'd been wrong for years. On the other, it meant the real suspect might finally be within reach. The DNA profile was uploaded into the national database. A partial match pinged, not a direct hit, but close enough to narrow it down to a specific family line. The cold case unit worked with genealogists, building a tree of relatives, branching through decades of records, trying to find someone who could match the profile more precisely. One name kept resurfacing across the data: Darrell Rusty Kincaid, a mechanic who had lived in Benton Harbor during the mid-1980s. He drove an old blue work van. He had a history of minor arrests and disturbing accusations that never led to convictions. And he left town abruptly in early 1986, only a few months after the twins disappeared. When Hale saw Kincaid's name, something clicked. The blue van, the witness in 2001. The second vehicle theory. Everything that never fit suddenly made sense. The next step was clear. The cold case unit tracked down Kincaid's closest relatives and, with their consent, collected new DNA samples. The comparison was definitive. The adult male DNA found on the backpack strap matched the Kincaid bloodline. It was the first concrete evidence in 35 years linking someone to the disappearance of Jacob and Jamal Carter. There was only one problem. Darrell Rusty Kincaid had died in 2003. He couldn't be interrogated, confronted, or pushed into confessing. He was gone. But he had left something behind, something the investigators had spent decades searching for. A real suspect, a real direction, a real chance to solve the case. Once the DNA results pointed toward Darrell "Rusty" Kincaid, the investigation shifted into a new phase. Detectives dug into everything they could find about him, piecing together a man who had somehow slipped through the cracks for decades. Kincaid had been 29 years old in 1985. He worked as a mechanic at a small garage on the edge of town, a place known for cheap repairs and long waits. People who knew him described him as unpredictable, someone who could be friendly one moment and volatile the next. He wasn't social. He rarely talked about his personal life, and he always seemed to be carrying some kind of anger beneath the surface. Former co-workers reported that he often drove an old blue van with peeling paint and a loud engine. Some remembered he kept tools and scrap metal in the back, along with clothes and blankets that made it look like he sometimes slept in it. No one had thought much about it back then. It was the kind of vehicle no one really noticed. But when the cold case unit tracked down old employment records, they realized something important. Kincaid's garage sat directly along one of the alternate routes leading from Maple Street to the school. If the boys had strayed even slightly from their usual path, they could have passed by the shop. Detectives interviewed anyone who still remembered him. Some old co-workers recalled that Kincaid showed up late on November 14, 1985, the day the twins vanished. He seemed flustered and agitated. One man claimed Kincaid kept looking out the windows and stepping outside repeatedly, as if expecting someone to show up, or as if he feared someone would. Others remembered that he quit the job abruptly a few months later and left town without saying goodbye. His departure had always seemed strange, but no one connected it to the disappearance of the twins at the time. Everyone thought he just got tired of the work or found trouble elsewhere. The more detectives uncovered Kincaid, the more the puzzle pieces tightened around him. His criminal records included accusations from neighbors who claimed he followed their children, though those cases never went anywhere. One woman reported that he tried to lure her son into his van with the promise of candy, but she couldn't prove it, and he denied everything. The police back then dismissed the complaint as a misunderstanding. Now, viewed through the lens of the Carter investigation, those warnings painted a darker picture. Detective Hale couldn't shake the feeling that they had missed Kincaid from the very beginning. While the community obsessed over the brown van, the real threat had been the blue one, a van no one had ever properly investigated. Hale reread old reports, wondering how such an important detail had been allowed to fade into the background. New interviews revealed even more. A retired bus driver remembered seeing Kincaid's van speeding away from Maple Street the morning the boys disappeared. A former neighbor recalled hearing yelling near the garage around the same time. Someone else remembered seeing Kincaid loading something into the back of his van later that day, though they hadn't thought anything of it. The cold case unit also located distant relatives of Kincaid, hoping to learn where he lived after leaving Benton Harbor. They discovered he had moved between several towns before eventually settling in Indiana, where he died unexpectedly in 2003 at the age of 47. Even in death, Kincaid's history left a trail of unease. People described him as paranoid, afraid of being watched, and deeply secretive. Some believed he was hiding from something. Others believed he was hiding something. Now, after decades of uncertainty, the case finally had a suspect with real evidence attached to his name. But detectives knew that identifying him wasn't enough. They needed physical proof, a confession, something that could tie him definitively to the disappearance of the Carter twins. And somewhere out there, Kincaid had left behind exactly that. They just had to find it. With Kincaid now firmly in focus, detectives searched for anything he might have left behind. They dug into property records, storage rentals, old addresses, and anything that could connect his past to the twins' disappearance. Weeks passed with little progress until they discovered something unexpected. Kincaid had rented a small storage unit in 1985, just months before the boys vanished. The unit had remained untouched for years after his death, the rent kept up for a time by an unknown relative before finally lapsing. The facility manager confirmed that the unit had never been cleared out. The lock was old, rusted from decades without use. When investigators cut it open, they stepped into a room that smelled of dust, oil, and stale air. It was filled with boxes stacked haphazardly, old tools, broken appliances, and pieces of scrap metal. But among the clutter were items that immediately pulled their attention. In one corner sat a small cardboard box containing children's clothing from the mid-1980s. Shirts, socks, and a pair of scuffed sneakers. Some were sizes too small to belong to any child Kincaid was known to have. Another box held loose papers, schoolwork sheets, a few pencil drawings, and a ripped folder with faint fingerprints visible in the faded ink. Then detectives found something more disturbing, a map of Benton Harbor from 1985, marked with circles and arrows drawn in thick pen. One route stood out, the exact path Jacob and Jamal took to school every morning. The intersections were highlighted. The alley behind Maple Street was circled twice. Tucked beneath the map, they found an old cassette tape. The label was blank. They brought it back to the lab and played it on an old recorder. The audio was uneven, static-filled, but Kincaid's voice was unmistakable, slow, unstable, wavering between calm and panic. He talked about the year 1985. He talked about two boys he couldn't stop thinking about. He mentioned driving around the neighborhood because he felt lonely, because he wanted company, because he saw an opportunity. His words drifted into rambling confessions. He said he didn't mean for things to happen like they did. He said the little one cried harder than the other. He said he got scared when they started screaming. He spoke about someone else being there. Another man who tried to calm him down, someone who told him they had gone too far. Then the tape cut off abruptly, as if Kincaid had slammed the stop button or the recorder had malfunctioned. Detectives replayed the tape over and over, listening for clues. Kincaid didn't say the boys' names, but the context was too close to ignore. The details matched the timeline. The fear in his voice felt too real to be fiction. The mention of a second man introduced a new angle, one the original investigation had completely missed. The storage unit provided more than just the tape. Under a pile of scrap metal, investigators found a rusted metal toolbox with items that didn't belong to a mechanic. Inside were a small toy car, a piece of red fabric, and a cracked plastic watch believed to be from a child's wrist. The watch matched a description Evelyn had given back in 1985. A small blue watch Jamal wore everywhere, even to bed. The evidence couldn't be explained away anymore. It is linked to Kincaid. It linked to the boys. It linked to a day the entire town tried to forget. But the tape raised a critical question. Kincaid spoke of another man, someone who was with him that morning, someone who helped, someone who knew what happened. If that man was still alive, he might be the final key to uncovering the truth. Investigators weren't done yet. They had one more person to find. Investigators focused on the final clue left on the cassette tape. Kincaid's mention of another man, someone who had been with him the morning the twins disappeared, someone who never appeared in any police report, someone who had stayed invisible for 35 years. Detective Hale and the Cold Case Unit began combing through records from the garage where Kincaid worked in 1985. They looked at employee lists, old schedules, pay stubs, and names that had long since drifted out of the town's memory. One name kept appearing next to Kincaid's on shift logs: Thomas Rayburn. Rayburn had been 25 at the time, quiet, unremarkable, and easily overlooked. He'd left Benton Harbor months after Kincaid and had never returned. After tracking his movements through old addresses and public records, investigators found him living in a nursing facility in Ohio. He was in his 70s now, frail, with failing lungs and limited time left. When detectives visited, Rayburn immediately recognized Kincaid's name. His reaction wasn't one of confusion, but fear. A sudden tightening of his jaw, a flicker of panic in his eyes. For a moment, he tried to pretend he didn't know anything. But years of silence weighed on him, and his health was rapidly declining. He seemed tired of secrets, tired of carrying something he never should have been part of. It didn't take long for the truth to break through. He confessed. He said Kincaid had become fixated on the Carter twins. He watched them walk to school. He followed them from a distance. He talked about them constantly, about how easy it would be to grab them. Rayburn claimed he told Kincaid to stop, that it was dangerous, that it was wrong. But on the morning of November 14th, Kincaid insisted on driving near the school route. Rayburn admitted he was in the passenger seat of the blue van when they saw the boys. He said Kincaid pulled over quickly, too quickly. Jamal tried to run. Jacob froze. Kincaid grabbed them before Rayburn could stop him. He said the entire moment lasted seconds, but the panic afterward lasted hours. Rayburn said he never touched the boys, never wanted to be involved, but he didn't go to the police, didn't intervene, didn't help them escape. He was there, and he did nothing. He told investigators where Kincaid took them: an abandoned pump house near a swampy field just outside town. A place the police never searched thoroughly back then because it was just beyond the mapped search zone. Rayburn said he remembered the cracked concrete floor, the rusted pipes, the smell of mold, and stale water. He remembered the boys crying. He remembered Kincaid losing control. He claimed the boys didn't suffer, but his voice trembled when he said it, and detectives doubted that part immediately. Before leaving, Rayburn gave clear, specific directions to the pump house. He described its location in detail: a few miles off the main road, surrounded by cattails, hidden by overgrown brush and fallen branches. A place forgotten by time. It was the first time anyone had provided a precise location tied to the twins. The confession wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't filled with emotion. It was quiet, almost whispering. The kind of truth that comes from a man who knows his time is short and his conscience can no longer bear the weight of silence. When investigators left the nursing facility that evening, they knew exactly where they were going next. For the first time in 35 years, they had a real chance to bring Jacob and Jamal home. The next morning, investigators drove to the location Thomas Rayburn described. The area had changed over the decades, but the land still carried an eerie stillness. Tall cattails swayed in the wind. The ground was uneven, waterlogged in places, and littered with fallen branches. After pushing through the overgrowth, they found it, the abandoned pump house, just where Rayburn said it would be. The structure was barely standing. Cracked concrete walls leaned inward, and the metal door had rusted completely off its hinges. Moss climbed up the sides, and the roof sagged. But it was unmistakably a man-made shelter, untouched for years. Inside, it was dark, damp, and suffocatingly still. The floor was broken in several places. Slabs of concrete shifted over time by erosion and settling soil. Investigators carefully inspected every corner, searching for anything unusual. Near the back of the room, beneath a large, cracked section of concrete, they noticed something different about the soil. It looked disturbed, darker than the surrounding dirt. A forensic team began to remove the broken slab piece by piece. Underneath, they found fabric first, shredded, faded, barely recognizable after decades underground. Then small bones emerged, fragile and pale. For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of 35 years of searching hung over them. They continued digging until they uncovered two small sets of remains, buried closely together, positioned as if the boys had never been separated. Dental records confirmed what everyone already knew. The remains belonged to Jacob and Jamal Carter. News of the discovery spread quickly. The town that had once searched for the boys in the cold November wind now held a collective breath. People who barely remembered the case still felt the impact. Those who had lived through it carried a mix of grief and relief. After decades of uncertainty, the truth had finally surfaced. Detective Hale called Evelyn personally. Her reaction was a mixture of trembling heartbreak and soft acceptance. She had carried hope for 35 years, but deep down she had feared this outcome all along. She thanked Hale through tears, grateful that her boys had finally been found, grateful that the not knowing was finally over. A memorial service was held in the town where the twins had lived, laughed, and disappeared. Residents placed flowers near their old school route. Some had been children themselves when the boys vanished, now adults standing with their own families, remembering the fear that had changed their childhoods. For Hale, the discovery brought closure, but not peace. He thought about the missed clues, the lost years, the mistakes that had allowed the truth to stay buried for so long. But he also felt a sense of fulfillment. He had kept his promise. The twins were finally brought home. Though the answers came too late for real justice, the truth was no longer hidden in the dark. The case that haunted a city for more than 3 decades had finally reached its end. In the weeks after the discovery, Benton Harbor felt different. The city had carried the weight of the twins' disappearance for so long that their recovery changed the atmosphere in ways people couldn't fully explain. The quiet places where the boys once walked seemed softer, less haunted. The cold November morning that had defined the town's fear for decades finally had an ending. People talked openly about the case again, not with the same sharp edge of panic they once felt, but with a gentle sadness mixed with relief. For years, They had wondered what happened. Now they knew. The story no longer ended with a question mark. Evelyn visited the spot where her sons were found. She stood alone for a long time, looking at the land that had held them all these years. She wasn't angry anymore, just tired. Losing the twins had carved a wound that never truly healed. But knowing the truth allowed her to breathe in a way she hadn't since 1985. She whispered their names softly, letting the wind carry her voice across the empty field. Detective Hale retired shortly after the case closed. He kept a copy of the final report on his desk at home, not because he needed it, but because it reminded him why he became a detective in the first place. He never forgot the mistakes made in the early days of the investigation, but he also understood that solving the case, even decades later, meant something. It meant the boys were no longer lost. It meant the community finally had answers. It meant Evelyn could stop searching. The story of Jacob and Jamal became part of local history. Teachers mentioned them during safety lessons. Parents told their children about sticking together, staying aware, and being careful on the way to school. Their memory served as a reminder of the fragility of innocence, the importance of community, and the need to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Though the case was solved, the lessons it left behind lingered. It showed how easily truth could be buried, how long justice could be delayed, and how persistence, no matter how slow, no matter how painful, could eventually uncover what was hidden. Most of all, the story became a testament to a mother's love, a detective's determination, and a town's refusal to forget two small boys who never got to grow up. Jacob and Jamal Carter were gone, but they were no longer missing. They were found. And at last, after decades of silence, the final chapter of their story had been written.